The fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria has left a great deal of uncertainty. Questions persist. Will peace and stability finally come to Syria? Can its broken economy be rebuilt? And will millions of Syrians who fled during the years of civil war return home to rebuild their country? Well, no one can know for sure, but the Turkish newspaper The Daily Sabah has given us their 2 cents and outlined 5 scenarios that they think are most likely for Syria's future.
Rebel forces in Damascus have declared the capital city free of longtime ruler Bashar al-Assad.
The fall of Assad's regime in Syria has been faster than anyone imagined.
Tonight, scenes of triumph across Syria as rebel forces celebrate their stunning victory over the Assad regime.
The first one is the most idealistic. It's just a democratic Syria, one where the opposition groups who overthrew Assad and are now in power come together in unity, work together, and are able to achieve significant support from the West, maybe from Turkey, to rebuild Syria. We'll go into some of the challenges that face this scenario later in the video. The second one would be an Islamist Syria, one where Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which was the Islamist wing of the Syrian opposition and the one that led the final charge against Bashar al-Assad in early December, comes to rule the country almost exclusively and sets up a Salafist regime. However, the Daily Sabah says that this government may actually be less hostile to American and Israeli interests compared to the previous Iran and Russia-allied Bashar al-Assad regime. The third scenario is perhaps the least likely, and that would be a sort of Israeli puppet regime, or at least a government in Damascus that's very much amenable to Israeli interests and works to contain Iran. It doesn't seem very likely. The population in Syria is generally pretty anti-Israel. Israel is probably content with just expanding the buffer zone that it has around the Golani Heights, Mount Hebron kind of area. And it's already knocked out a lot of the Syrian Arab army's military equipment that could have been used against it in the event of a wider war with Iran. Also, it's destroyed a lot of the air defense that was in Syria that could have potentially been used by Iran as a sort of early warning system in the event of a wider regional air war between the two. The fourth scenario sees the federalization of Syria, sort of Syria being more like Bosnia is following the Dayton Accords. So that would see different areas of Syria gain more autonomy. You would have different areas for the different sort of sects and ethnicities in the country. So you'd have an Alawite state, maybe along the coast, a Druze state in the south. These existed when you had the French Mandate of Syria and it was run in this federalized way. The problem with this is that it could lead to political deadlock as the tensions get exacerbated between the different factions and they each work for themselves. Bosnia doesn't exactly work that well. It may risk turning into the fifth scenario, which would be the total collapse of Syria along sectarian lines or maybe political lines, the same way that, somewhere like Libya collapsed following the overthrow of Gaddafi. Perhaps the most worrying scenario for a lot of people in the event of this scenario would be the resurgence of ISIS, which Secretary of State Antony Blinken has already been warning about. The potential for something, maybe not ISIS, but something very similar to ISIS being created, as you now have a load of unemployed former Syrian Arab army officers and soldiers who, they stopped fighting, they defected during the Bashar al-Assad's fall. But ISIS also came about from the former Ba'athist officers and soldiers who fought under Saddam, who ended up forming the backbone of ISIS. So there's a potential for a similar thing to happen with former Syrian Arab army officers, which would then have a destabilizing effect across the entire region. So how close are we to the nightmare fifth scenario, the total collapse? Well, thankfully, at the moment, the emphasis in Syria really just seems to be on unity and not allowing anything to divide the opposition during the transitional period, whether that be the prime minister, the leader of this transitional government, Mohammed al-Bashir, who is urging against any kind of infighting amongst the opposition during this complicated period, whether that be Syrians themselves, who on social media, again, are really emphasizing that unity. Like, we're all Syrians, it doesn't matter, Sunni, Alawite, or whatever. Christians as well. We're seeing images and videos out of places like Homs that Christians are being left alone, they're being allowed to celebrate Christmas. A lot of people had feared that the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham dominated government would persecute them, but we haven't seen any of that yet. And also the Alawites, the sect from which Bashar al-Assad comes. A lot of people feared that there would be persecution maybe against them, reprisals for the decades that they ran the country. Outside of some problems navigating transitional government-run roadblocks as they're trying to move around the country, according to BBC Arabic, there hasn't been too much in anything in the way of persecution against the Alawites. And local leaders again in Tartus and Latakia are really urging unity. They don't want any kind of division. Interestingly, the Washington Examiner ran a story that claimed that prior to his fall, Assad had gone to Russia and asked them to help him carve out a coastal Alawite state to help shore up Russian interests there, their military assets, their naval base in Tartus and their air base in Hmeimim. But Vladimir Putin rejected the idea and urged unity. I have no idea how true this is. Assad's own statement that he released from his new home in Moscow a few days ago contradicts this. But the main point still stands that so far, any kind of talk of an Alawite state being created and the collapse of Syria along these ethnic lines, at the moment, it isn't happening. But there is an exception, and that exception would be in the northeast of the country, which has been de facto independent since 2016 with the Kurdish-controlled territories in Rojava. And it's in this northeastern part of Syria, the Kurdish-controlled area, where the nightmare scenario would look more likely to unfold. You've already got fighting between the Kurds and Turkish-backed groups, and Turkey itself is getting involved with airstrikes and aiming to push the SDF, the Syrian Defense Forces, or the Kurdish units in Syria beyond the Euphrates River. But we will cover this in more detail in another video that focuses more on Turkey's involvement and what it's got out of the Syrian civil war. And of course, it's not just Turkey who's involved in the Syrian conflict. Of course, Russia has its military assets along the coast. Iran has been deeply involved in the country's civil war. American forces are in the east of the country, around the country's oil fields. Israel has conducted 350 airstrikes on Syria just since Bashar al-Assad's fall, and obviously, as we talked about, has its buffer zone in the south. Even non-state actors like Hezbollah from Lebanon have also been heavily involved. Well, they were heavily involved until they were severely decimated in 2024. So the country sits on geopolitical tectonic plates, lots of major powers rubbing up against each other and causing instability. And then the country itself is inherently unstable because it has its own internal tectonic plates of different religious sects, different ethnicities. So the country is unstable. It's had more than a decade of civil war, so it's no wonder that the economy is completely destroyed. Currently, 71% of Syrians, that's 16.7 million people, are required as of 2024. Food insecurity affects 12.9 million people. It's basically the price of essential goods has skyrocketed since 2011. So you think it's bad where you are, the price inflation on grocery products, while in Syria it's gone up 133 times more if we compare it with 2013. Overall, the Syrian economy, according to the World Bank, has shrunk by 54% from 2010 to 2021. And then government expenditure during this period also plummeted by 87%. The economic situation has been made even worse by the US sanctions placed on the country, which were actually first placed on the country in 1979 when Hafez al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's father, was in charge. The country was designated as a state sponsor of terrorism, but they were then expanded significantly in 2011, and the sanctions looked to target the Assad regime's ability to finance its war against the opposition. They would freeze the assets of government officials, they banned trade in Syrian oil, and prohibited any kind of US investment into the country. So the efforts were to isolate Syria from international trade, which obviously further exacerbates the economic problems in the country. How did the Syrian government then respond to this? To finance itself? Well, it turned to Captagon. So Captagon is an amphetamine-type stimulant. It was originally developed in the 1960s as a medical treatment, but then it was banned in 1986 because it had a lot of potential for abuse, and counterfeit production of the drug then switched to the Middle East. It became a $5.6 billion lifeline for the Assad regime during the civil war years. It didn't just end up financing Assad, his government, and their section of the war, but it created regional instability as the trade spilled over into neighboring countries like Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and caused social problems in these countries too. The new government has pledged to purify Syria of the narco economy, dismantle it, but again, easier said than done, because the trade networks, the smuggling routes, the production, everything is very, very well established in the country. So it's going to be very hard to break that down, especially in an economy that's going to take a very long time to recover. And so who's actually tasked with leading the country now to overcome these challenges? Well, the transitional government is led by Prime Minister Mohammed al-Bashir. We've mentioned him already today. So he's a former leader in the Idlib Salvation government, which was dominated by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So he has a mandate basically to rule until March 2025. And he's created an administration that does have a lot of former Assad-appointed ministers, as well as some new leadership. So the idea is to sort of have stability, but also reform. The most famous figure, though, in the new government isn't the Prime Minister, who you may have heard of or you may not even have heard of, but I'm sure you've all heard of Ahmed al-Sharaa, who was better known by his previous nom de guerre, Abu Mohammed al-Jolani. And he was the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, who really helped to orchestrate the final overthrow of Assad. So Hayat Tahrir al-Sham evolved from al-Nusra Front, which claims to have severed its ties with al-Qaeda in 2016. But despite attempting to, project moderation and inclusivity, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is still designated as a terrorist organization by the UN, the US, the UK, and a bunch of others. So there's a lot of challenges there when it comes to securing the foreign aid that's needed to rebuild the country. Still though, Jolani is doing a lot to try and legitimize the new government. He established the Syrian Salvation Government in Idlib during the sort of interim period when the conflict was frozen. He likes to do interviews where he really emphasizes the need to build institutions in the country and also to concentrate weapons solely in the hands of the state, which was a pivot from what was going on previously, which is just, fragmentation of the country into lots of armed groups. He did a recent interview with a Syrian journalist named Hussein al-Hassan. He highlighted a few key priorities that he will look to implement. Again, the focus is always on building institutions rather than relying on individual leaders. The state has to take precedence over factions. So the immediate goals would be rebuilding destroyed homes, returning the displaced Syrians, and fostering unity across all the regions, especially in the Kurdish majority eastern districts. So al-Sharaa has appealed for Syrians for patience, assuring them that within 2 years, progress can be made towards restoring Syria's stability and, as he puts it, greatness. But is the international community really going to trust an Islamist-led Syria? Well, Secretary of State Antony Blinken and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer said that if they fulfill key conditions, like protection of civilians, respect for minorities, and commitment to a peaceful transition of power, then they will begin to trust this new government. And it lies somewhere between, if we think back to the Daily Sabah's 5 predictions, it's kind of between number 1 and number 2, a sort of Western-backed Syria, Western-supported Syria, and a Salafist, Islamist-run Syria as well. What we need to remember is that in the Middle East, secular doesn't always have the same meaning that it does in Western countries, where we just think of it meaning separating religion and the state. It's come to have an association with dictators across much of the Middle East. So as always, a big emphasis on unity, at least currently, from Jolani. But the key question is, when it comes to will the international community trust this new government, and will they be able to rebuild the economy? It all comes down to getting foreign money into the country to help rebuild. It's kind of difficult to do that and rebuild a country where 90% of the people are currently below the poverty line. If the country's ruling party is designated as a terror group, it's not going to bode well for the lifting of sanctions on the country. If they fulfill some of the requirements that will be put on them, international aid is never free. It always comes with some kind of requirement. If they are fulfilling whatever requirements their donors want, then we'll start to see the international aid flood in. But who knows? The requirements from the West could be very different from the requirements from the Gulf, which could be very different from the requirements from Turkey. And even Russia does have some cards to play still in terms of cheap grain. The geopolitical tectonic plates will again start to rub up against each other. Which brings us back to the other big question. If the country has a government that is not under sanctions, is more internationally welcomed, and the economy starts to rebuild, will Syrians start to return home? Well, there's 6 million Syrians who sought refuge abroad, and then 7 million who are displaced internally throughout the country. Turkey is trying to facilitate returns, but migration experts think that it will be a gradual repatriation. You won't get a mass exodus because many Syrians are just sort of observing to see how the new transitional government manages the economy and the potential for infighting in the country. In Europe, where the issue of Syrian refugees has become a major political talking point, countries like Austria and the UK have suspended all asylum applications for Syrians, despite the UN warning that Syria's volatile conditions fail to meet the 1951 Refugee Convention's criteria for safe returns. Denmark, which has hosted 35,000 Syrians, has paused deportation processing, but expects refugees to aid in rebuilding once stability improves, which hasn't happened yet. Austria is offering a €1,000 return bonus for voluntary returns, though high travel costs and, again, the lack of current stability mean that, €1,000 is probably not going to get you very far. So European countries, at least seemingly pressuring Syrian refugees to return. So, at the end of the day, which of Daily Saba's predictions do you think is most likely? I am probably pessimistic, and I do think that as the geopolitical tectonic plates start to rub up against each other again, it might be different actors this time. Russia and Iran may be excluded, but there's still a lot of fighting between different factions. The country is inherently unstable, its borders are artificial, they were drawn by the French and the British following World War I. The country just sits on too many tectonic plates, both internationally and internally, that I do think the fifth scenario is probably the most likely. I know I've said that currently, at the moment, there's this massive emphasis on unity and stability. Will it last? Well, hopefully I'm wrong. Let us know what you think. Give us your thoughts and your comments below. We will cover in future videos the wider, I've talked about the tectonic plates. We'll go into that in more detail. The winners and the losers from this current round of the Syrian conflict. So I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I'll see you next time.